So yes, hot, and we're all getting through it as best we can. I don't know if anyone's got any tips to keep cool, but I was putting it on social media and people saying fill up your hot water bottles with water, and then put them in the freezer and then put them in your bed, apparently, and it keeps the sheets cool. So I hadn't heard of that one, so I might try that. Because I was just saying that my son Angelo, obviously he's finding it really difficult with the humidity at night, as we all are, but he just kept running up and down the stairs, and I thought, isn't that going to make you feel even hotter? We just, there was certain pieces on the computer that he had to watch, and then finally he settled down about 2:30. So then yeah, it was difficult to sleep, but hey, we just got to keep going a day at a time. So just a couple of things that I wanted to share. So please don't forget to sign up to our free newsletter. Marla, who's on here at the minute, has been with me quite a long time. She needs a gold medal. So she completes and basically coordinates the newsletters for us, and so please sign up every quarter and you can get up-to-date information on what the charity's doing. Just wanted to draw your attention to First Steps. So we've extended the closing date. So if you know of an autistic adult, or you might be an autistic adult yourself, that you might like to set up a business online, we have something that's called First Steps. So all the information is on the charity website, and the closing date is at the end of August. So if you've got an idea for a business and you want to put it down on paper and you want to pitch it to us, there's 4 judges. And then we will choose our winner, and then that person will get mentoring support throughout the year, and then we will feed back to everyone on how the business is going. But it has to be an online business. So if you check out the information, it's all on the charity website. There's an application form on there, and if there's anything that you feel might need a little bit of clarification, just email the charity and then we can help you and guide you in the right direction. So, and also a bit of exciting news, the charity on Friday, sadly I wasn't there because I went to the Northeast. I'd already booked it because it's hard for me to get to go and see my mum and my sister and my family. So we actually won the Jim Mansell Outstanding Contribution Award. So that was fantastic news. So an award and a certificate is winging its way to the charity. So woohoo to all my team. I couldn't do what I do without all of my team of volunteers, and they're amazing. We're all very passionate, we're all very driven, we're all focusing on lots of events that are coming up. But today, one of my charity ambassadors and autism consultant, Paul, is going to be talking about autism and PDA. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so this workshop is going to be an overview of autism and PDA, and I'll give a brief introduction to myself prior, and then looking at different strategies that can help with PDA in terms of communication, objects of reference, etc.
So, do you want questions at the end?
Yeah,
Okay.
unless someone wants to speak prior, but I understand it's recording, so it's probably best to be at the end. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Just so that everyone knows. All right. Then. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to myself in terms of birth and early years and developmental trajectory. I was born in 1986. Part of my autism trajectory is prematurity. So I was born a month premature. Brain injury due to cerebral hypoxia, which was to do with placental abruption, and genetics as well. There's other people diagnosed on the spectrum in my family. I was blind to the right side of my body, which is a condition called hemiplegia, and I was non-verbal and had speech and language delay, and didn't gain functional speech until later infancy, so 7 or 8 years old. That's just a picture of me. I should have had it prior, but nevertheless, I believe in January 1987. And for further context, I wasn't diagnosed until 24 with autism and obsessive compulsive disorder, and then in 2012 at the age of 26 I was diagnosed with visual perceptual challenges and learning difficulties. So the overview of autism, very briefly, is that it isn't one thing. And this image here is based on Donna Williams' autism fruit salad model, which I talk about a lot in different contexts. So you break it down into information processing, which can be sensory perception, learning disabilities, language processing, sleep disorders, attention deficits, whatever. And then you've got the environment that the person's in. You've got the styles of learning in the middle, the bottom image. I forget what type of shape that is. And then to the left, you have mental health, so psychiatric comorbidities, which can come along with the autism and even get misconstrued as the autism. And then you get identity and personality, and that starts from, you could argue, year dot. Genetic factors are ensued because you get likenesses from your parents, grandparents, etc., the family line. And that is just a basic overview of autism using her analogy, where you're actually breaking down the pieces and breaking them down succinctly. So I have spoken over the years about exposure anxiety, and I have created an image and an infographic to try and correlate the similarities and the significant differences between the two. So on the left, you have exposure anxiety, and the similarities I'll go into in a moment. So exposure anxiety is a condition where one is triggered by the awareness of self. So the awareness of self then goes into the middle where the similarities are, where you have a negative nervous system response. So this could include, but not exclusively, chronic fight, flight and freeze states, but also responses to try and, I would say, settle the nervous system. So you could have, at the extreme, chronic avoidance, retaliation, diversion responses. And exposure anxiety was coined in 1991 by Donna Williams. On the other side, you've got PDA, and PDA was first written about in, I believe, the 1980s. And what that is, or what has been noted by the specialist initially, was that there were a group of children who struggled and were triggered by demands. And there you go into the similarities again. Their nervous system was being negatively impacted in some way, which would cause the nervous system to go into a chronic fight, flight, and freeze state. And then what you would get is chronic avoidance, retaliation, diversion responses. So breaking that down, EA is where the nervous system is triggered by self-awareness. PDA seems to be a person who is triggered by demands. So some of these strategies at the bottom can help. I believe someone is, if someone who's just joined, if you just turn off your microphone, please. Yeah, thank you very much. So the strategies that ensue are similar and can work for both. So you can focus on the object issue, not the person, which I'm going to go through later in the slides. That's called indirect confrontation. So you are actually directing, but indirectly, which sounds counterintuitive, but I'll explain how that works in terms of word placement, semantics, and use of language. The other aspect is don't be a helicopter. So if you are hovering, watching, waiting, expecting, then you cause this nervous system response potentially. If you're self-owning and show autonomy, and that's about, I think that's going more into a philosophical approach, your own way of interacting with people, which you need to modify. So you don't assume or project, you actually go and work parallel with the person's nervous system. Leave the person wanting more. Well, if you start garnering these strategies, then what that means is that you can actually begin to build trust. And if you begin to build trust, which is a basic way of any human being opening up to anybody else, then you start to relax the person's nervous system. So you can use reverse psychology. So no means yes and yes means no, because what it does is it then actually, the metaphor here is you're putting the ball into the other person's court, and you're actually getting them to actually say what they really want or need or prefer out of the situation. And again, if you work parallel with the system, you're not butting heads, you're not creating angst, albeit inadvertently, which a lot of the times it is. You're actually working with their system, not against. And that is a basic overview of some strategies, and also an overview of the differences and the significant similarities, I think, between exposure anxiety and PDA. And next slide, sometimes they are slow. Here we are. So an introduction to PDA is looking at the overlap again between similar conditions. So there is considerable overlap between exposure anxiety and conditions such as PDA, which we're talking about now. First diagnosed in 2008. However, I do know a family who had their son diagnosed in 1997. Oppositional defiance disorder. So that was first written about, or has been around in literature since 2002. Avoidant personality disorder and dependent personality disorder. So understanding EA and thus PDA is living or working with people who are in chronic fight and flight states. And this could be children, this could be teenagers, this could be adults, it could be in multiple contexts, it could be at home, it could be outside, it could be in education, etc. Those living or working with compulsive avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses. So this could be carers, guardians, parents, teachers, etc. Those living or working with chronic anxiety disorders, and those living with attachment disorders, anxiety disorders, oppositional defiance, PDA, dependent personality disorder. These are multiple diagnoses, of course, and you are free to research all of these and look at their presentations and the multiple diagnoses and what they mean for the person who's been diagnosed with them. And ultimately, where a directly confrontational approach doesn't work, such as applied behavioral analysis, which is a lot about direct confrontation, watching, waiting, expecting, and then what that can cause is the nervous system to negatively respond. So when you look at that, we're looking at the nervous system now, and PDA and information processing can butt heads. So if someone has what one would call a PDA profile, there may well be other things that are going on. So it could be that they have got alexithymia and struggle with understanding their emotions. It could be that they have language processing challenges to varying different degrees, and they're meaning deaf to various different percentages, which means that the interpretive world is challenging or difficult. They may well have visual perceptual challenges, which make the physical world and thus the social world difficult to navigate. They may have social emotional agnosia, where they don't see body language, facial expression, or tone of voice, and all they hear is facts, and that can cause significant barriers. Maybe they're face blind and struggle with bonding. So usually I would say, similarly to EA, PDA will come along with various different information processing challenges as well, and that's a worthy thing to note. So when we look at semantics and how we use language with PDA, you can look at this diagram here to just give a basic example. So on one hand, you've got direct response to the nervous system. So directness impacts the nervous system, which impacts the response, which impacts the association with what has happened, the dialogue, the interaction, etc. When you look at a more indirect way of speaking, so you can focus on the object, not the person, you focus on the context, not the person, you allow yourself to be self-owning, then what can happen is a calming response to the nervous system. So the nervous system in effect becomes more balanced. And then what happens is that you have a more positive association with what is happening. That is actually potentially boosting the person's self-esteem. It's allowing the person to actually piece together that actually communication demands are not going to stress or aggravate my anxiety levels, and I'm able to actually interact without needing to resort, or I think a better word would be resort to these compulsive chronic diversion responses, retaliation responses, and effectively blocking responses. You're trying to take away the feeling of the demand, and by taking away the feeling of the demand, that means that the demand won't be met. So it goes in a vicious cycle. So what I mean by reverse semantics, which I'm going to go into, is the way in which you word and sentence things. So it's the structure of sentences, it's the way sentences are built, and largely they are built directly. Like, for example, hello, how are you? Are you having a good day? Could you put your shoes on, please? Could you unload the dishwasher for me? Could you wash the car? Could you write out an essay? And when you actually start thinking about the direct nature of how people speak to one another, when it becomes difficult in terms of demand and direction, that's when it can become challenging in certain environments. And this could be a more casual domestic environment, where you're actually asking the person to do chores and things around the home, to more complicated environments such as employment, where the whole basis of you being there is to actually respect and adhere demands, and similarly in education as well. So when you look at that, it's a big thing, this direct communication. It garners a large percentage of how people communicate throughout their day-to-day lives. So indirect communication may be intuitively very different and difficult to adhere, and it may take some fine-tuning and some time to do so. So with that in mind, we're going to think about how your energy is being supplied when you're with a person. And helicopter versus supplier is an example I'm going to unpack now. So you imagine being in a room with someone with PDA and you're watching, waiting, expecting. It's an energy you're giving off. It's the use of body language. It's something that is initially not very tangible because it's energy based partly, but it also might be to do with the words you're using in correlation with your body language, in correlation with your movements. And then there's this garnered sense of expectation. So hovering may actually cause these responses to come about. And of course, depending on what context these responses are in, this can cause additional challenges. For example, if it's in an educational setting, the person may, and not through any sense of fairness, may be labelled as difficult or unreachable, or have an inability to be educated. In employment, it might be that they potentially lose jobs, or that they are deemed not ready for employment, because the nature of employment, as I said, with the similarities with education, is that demands are put upon you in daily life. So what way can you actually alleviate this sense of being hovered over? It could be like an omnipresent feeling, and a presence that means that your nervous system is not in a space to be regulated, or not in a space to be calmed. So watching, waiting, expecting can do this. So indirect ways of going about this, if we use the example of an essay that needs to be filled out, or a piece of paper that needs to be written on, you could use ways such as not ensuring your patterns. So you could happen to go in the room, happen to put the piece of paper on the table, for example, and happen to leave. So what you're doing, you are supplying, but you're not watching, waiting, expecting. And also partly what you're doing is you're respecting the person's autonomy as well, where the focus point isn't the demand or the person, it's actually the context, the object, that is the focus. So we're actually going into more interpersonal elements such as trust that the person will be able to perform the task or do something now that you found out a way that actually works. So that builds up through time, that builds up through getting to know the person, and in effect, I suppose, not actually defining the person by PDA. As I say, likewise with autism, it's a similar philosophy I would have for anything else. And when we go into objects of reference, this expands upon the earlier slide about semantics and use of language. So this example is quite clear. On one side, you've got the words, and on the other side, you've got a pair of shoes. So the shoes are ready to be walked in. You can see what you're doing with the words. You're humanizing to some degree the object, which is the shoes. You're not demanding in a direct sense. You are not saying, please put your shoes on. Can you get your shoes on now? We need to go. What you're doing is you're working with the person's profile. Another thing, I can give an example with working with a gentleman with PDA, which I use in EA because it's interchangeable, is when he was struggling to cook and they were putting demands on him. His nervous system was reacting accordingly. So I thought about what his likes and dislikes were, getting to know the person, being with the person, ensuring trust with the person. And he liked Disney and cartoons. So this character I put on was almost like a waiter or a butler. And I said, the pan is ready to be tended to, because there was something in the pan. So I was focusing on the pan, I was focusing on the object, rather than ensuring a demand, which freed up his nervous system, which meant he was able to actually start cooking, because he's able to cook. He's able to do many things. So it's presuming competence as well. It's presuming that the person does have the ability to do things. It's the PDA that can sometimes be this invisible block. So PDA does overlap with other things, and that's worth mentioning here. So you could have someone who's naturally avoidant, who consciously is avoidant, and that means that they will avoid potential social situations. Those who are passive aggressive can be avoidant, but they can also use the monopoly of power. So passive aggressive people could potentially struggle with certain emotions that come with directness. So they may use things like silent treatment as a way of diverting attention. Those with narcissistic personality disorders have delusions of grandeur. They think they're superior to other people, so they don't need to adhere to the demands of others because they are better than other people. So it's always looking at the underlying issues here. Those who are schizotypal are naturally non-conformist. So what schizotypal means is someone who is very self-owning, autonomous, doesn't adhere to cultural norms, and dances to the beat of their own drum. So non-conformity can come into potential presentation of PDA. Those tending towards antisocial personality disorder are driven by challenge and risk, as opposed to commonly avoiding the demands of others. So intentions there could be, I'm not going to listen to you because it's not fueling anything other than boredom. Those with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which has around 40% overlap with the dated diagnosis Asperger's syndrome, can be too addictively driven by fixations or obsessional interests. So that could present as PDA. And also what we've got to think about here is the underlying reasons for why things are going on. There's a few myth-busting exercises already that it's only autism in which you have special interests, and it isn't at all. You can find it in someone who's extremely conscientious. You can find it in people who are solitary. It's not specific to autism at all. So those with dependent personality disorder commonly avoid demands because they fear independence. So this is about codependency, and actually the fear of independence is could be so great that they invest in becoming more disabled than they actually are. This can lead to monopolization of carers, guardians, whoever, parents. So doing as a teacher or care instructs runs counter to this interior fear, this deep fear of independence, actually doing something for themselves. So they learn to be helpless, and they potentially learn to be more disabled than they really are. Those with gaming addictions and internet addictions will develop PDA due to their unmanaged addictions. So addictions in the most basic sense are neurological gratifications. So an addiction has a neurochemical effect on the brain. And this could be to do from substance abuse to actually things that you wouldn't believe a human being could get addicted to. It's quite amazing, such as gaming or internet addictions. And I had a brief stint of gaming addiction when I was very young, around 5 years old, and I went cold turkey because my mother actually noted that there was a great decrease in interest in going out. There was a great decrease in actually wanting to be out in nature, in fields, use my imagination, etc. And then finally, those with chronic information overload or associated chronic fight-flight state of exposure anxiety are subject to avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses may present as PDA. So that's what that is actually saying, is that they may not have PDA. They may actually have exposure anxiety. And if they've got exposure anxiety in correlation with information overload, which could be to do with various different information processing challenges, you can see why one has to unpick where this is actually coming from. And if we look at information processing deeper in the context of autism, does the person have a sense of their own body? Do they know that there are different parts of their body connected externally and internally? Do they recognize heat? Do they recognize thirst? Do they recognize hunger? Then you look at faces. Do they bond with faces, or do they find faces excruciatingly difficult to look at because they don't mean anything? Do they have to do compensatory things such as sculpting the person's face, looking for a familiar reference such as hairstyle, glasses, earrings, etc.? Social emotional things. So alexithymia, do they struggle to know how they think and feel in real time? And this also extends to what I said about body, knowing your internal systems first, hunger, tiredness, needing to go to sleep, etc. And not only feeling them, but in a physical sense, but also knowing how you emotionally feel. And people with alexithymia tend to have something called psychosomatic amplification. So already pre-existing sensory issues can be heightened because they don't know the origins of where they're coming from. Could it be that they struggle with social perception, which causes great stress and anxiety in social situations? The sensory organs work, but the person doesn't see or hear in the same way. Could it be that the person has got fragmented vision, flicks in front of their eyes, either with their hands or the pieces of straw I've seen, or pieces of plastic or toys, or use their hands themselves, fingers, arms, etc. Because the sensory processing and perceptual world is so difficult to navigate, and they alternately see it as both fascinating but actually threatening. Could it be that they have place blindness and they don't actually know where they are in space and time if they come from it from a different angle, or they use a different car or mode of transport, or certain things that have been changed significantly within the place of familiarity is so much that they actually feel lost? Sounds, the perception of sounds, the modulation of sounds, knowing the origins of sounds, and motion. Do they see motion as a fluid thing, or do they actually not see motion with clarity, where people just seem to pop out of nowhere, or they struggle to understand depth, or they struggle to understand the subtleties in movement as someone coming up to you or pouring a glass of water, etc. So the wider context is, what are the information processing challenges, and where do they come from, and how do they interact with the PDA? And then we go into this this conscious and unconscious thought. So doing unconscious thought could be a person who overthinks naturally, may have social emotional agnosia and is more logical and literal in the way they internalize information. So they may struggle with switching off, and they may need to have gentle direction in focusing on the moment, offering grounded and contextual solutions, presenting boundaries not as a threat, but as a need. I've worked with a gentleman who has emotional dysregulation and suicidal ideation. And one of the best things one can do in that situation is be honest about what your role is, what you can do, what you can't do, and offer boundaries and alternative methods of support. Because if you do not, if the person is processing things in such a logical and literal way, you have to mean what you say and say what you mean. So you may have to explain emotions in a pragmatic way. For example, lists, pictures, if they are pictorial learners, linking social behavior to emotional feelings. I've also seen other people use videos, TV programs, things like that to have an idea of how the social emotional world works. And then being in the moment is more me. So when I sit down, I tend to go to sleep very, very easily. If my body's not moving, I don't necessarily consciously think. So you can either look at that as a positive thing or a negative thing. I suppose there's an imbalance in the two, where one side is overthinking and the other side is potentially underthinking. And what I've learned to do is to get moving at times to stimulate the brain, because as soon as I sit down, I daydream a lot. I sleep, almost go motionless. So I need more, I would say, gentle, conscious thought. So such as bringing the tone of voice. You can use gesture or objects of reference and tapping on objects around the environment. You can look at that in two ways. I don't consider that infantile. For me, it has worked with me even as an adult, what I've just described there. And I think what people don't realize with me sometimes, that I do have significant mentalizing challenges still as an adult. You know, when you speak to me either through text or through words, that doesn't go through the same pictorial process as it does with someone who thinks and associates in pictures. So it's a significantly different way of modulating and interpreting what people are saying, thinking, doing, etc. And I'm more introspective than the latter. So you've got two systems here, one that's very logical and literal, and then one that potentially is more emotionally introspective and more connected with their emotions. But it doesn't mean the latter is emotionless. It just means you need to present these things in very different ways. And books I recommend are as follows. Exposure anxiety has such a significant overlap that I do recommend the book Exposure Anxiety, The Invisible Cage, and the Exposure Anxiety Handbook by Donna Williams. I hope you've enjoyed this. There is about 20 minutes plus for Q&A, which I think is a significant amount of time. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you've got something from this, ideas, but we can expand on these during the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. So has anyone got any questions? Are you still there, Tally, to be able to unmute people? No? Okay. So is there anybody who'd like to ask a question? If so, could you unmute yourself, please?
You don't have to show your faces, and you can chat. You can just put something in the chat if you want to.
Yeah.
It's all anonymous.
Have you worked more with children with PDA, Paul, or adults?
I've worked more with adults who either present as PDA or exposure anxiety. So with the gentleman in question who with the cooking, he was diagnosed in 97. And I believe one of the first people in the county to be diagnosed. And I've spoken many times to his parents, and also his mum in particular. And what I tried to build up at the day centre was you know, a uniform strategy, not just me writing something down, but actually giving it to staff. So when I wasn't there, staff would be able to refer to this and say, okay, we need to present information like this, because it wasn't just with, you know, cooking, it was with everything, you know, thresholds, you know, actually crossing a threshold from a room to another room, or going outside. So going from one piece of land to the other, which sounds odd, but that's where he struggled. And even getting in a car, you know, there'd be things that you wouldn't think about that actually he struggled with. And I can remember, you know, he said, I use this a lot, this example, where he said, you know, my legs are stuck, they need oiling, or something to that effect, which was echolalia, but it was contextual. It was from Return to Oz. And I said, the road is ready to be walked on, and he walked, because it's not a demand. It's not a demand. So what it's doing is, it's actually, the brain is reacting, his nervous system is freeing. So if your nervous system is freeing, then you're not stuck in that state of the chronic sort of fight, flight, freeze state. And he would go freeze, or he would get angry because it felt painful. Because he said it, when I asked him once, how does it feel when people ask of things? And he said, it feels like needles in my arm. So it was actually, he was actually getting a physical somatic negative response. So it was actually causing physical pain. Yeah. And once I realized that, that was very poignant.
Okay, there was a question that just popped up that somebody asked. Sorry, I didn't quite catch the name. Do you want to unmute yourself with reference to, I think you talked about your son possibly going through a diagnosis?
Oh, yes.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can. Kelly Harvey. My son has ADHD and ADHD and ADHD and ASD, I apologize. And I think he's got PDA too. But apparently he masks well at school. So when it comes to masking, I think we have to unpack what that potentially means. Could it be that the person is masking because of significant information processing delays? So delays throughout the whole day, which mean they don't react in time and in sync with what people are saying, asking, doing, etc. Could that be masking? Could it be that because of the information processing delays, that the person is dissociating? So they're dissociating from their environment, which means it looks like non-compliance. Could it be that the person's PDA profile means that they're naturally not non-conformist, which I spoke about prior, so with authority figures and things like that, and they're not willing to budge, so they're not going to listen to the teacher? Could it be that the person's PDA presents as such, where they may be very self-aware of their condition already, or they may be getting negative words thrown at them, even by, you know, sadly, I've heard over the years from school teachers or TAs or peers. So there could be very many different reasons why a person masks. When people talk about masking, I think we have to unpack what that actually means, and it means different things for different people. For example, when I was younger, you could have called my dissociation because of, I was about 80% meaning deaf at school, and that could have been seen as masking. It wasn't in the literal sense, it was me dissociating from the environment, so I wasn't compliant, or appeared not to be compliant.
Okay. People probably know about the Pathological Demand Avoidance Society. It's got a fantastic website. So if you are waiting for a diagnosis and you want to know what the process is all about, it's very comprehensive pages on there talking about diagnosis, the overview, what's the purpose of the diagnosis, collating evidence, which is obviously key, and try and keep it in some sort of date order as well, so that when that you're ready to go for the diagnosis with your son or your daughter or your loved one, you've got everything there to hand and you're not fumbling about, and you know what you're looking for. So they're saying that the diagnostic pathways, there's a local NHS pathway, there's the referral to the NHS specialist or independent diagnostic centre, private assessments. Some people are worried about private assessments. What's your opinion, Paul? Because the thing is, they say that sometimes they're not recognised. I don't know why, but what's your opinion on private assessment?
I mean, it's person same, but private. First thing that I think worries any family with a private assessment is money. These private assessments can rack up to, you know, £500 or £1,000 more. In fact, I heard many years ago, this was early on in my advocacy, about £2,000, and this was in a sort of reputable area in London as a specialist. I never knew the name of the specialist, but
Right.
that was what he was offering with regards to a private diagnosis. In terms of PDA, sadly, there are some counties that do not recognise PDA as a viable condition. So what happens is, even if you get the diagnosis, albeit privately or through the NHS, so it's a big slap in the face. Then the schools don't recognise it on the ECHP or employment or wherever, and that's another whole topic, isn't it? ECHPs, they really need modifying it. But yeah, there are people even that don't believe it exists. So yeah.
I think people are driven to private assessments as well because there's such a long waiting list yet again. And, you know, like diagnosis for me is like a big bone of contention. I've been sort of speaking about it for years, and people are now saying that again, they're waiting 2 years, 3 years, you know, it could even be longer. So that's why they are going for private assessments. And also, if you don't agree with the assessment, once you've been through the process, you can obviously, you know, say, right, this is, you know, I'm complaining or I want a second opinion. And I was just looking as well, which I didn't know, there's a helpful toolkit from Cerebra that gives some points if you don't agree and you're not satisfied at any stage of the process. So again, this is all on the PDA website. So please check that out if you are just starting on that journey. Has anybody else got any questions, or is there anything else you want to share, Paul?
There's a follow-up from this lady. She's put, he loves history and he loses interest if you ask him to do things. He will instantly say, "Mummy, what shall I do? My brain can't make up its mind and fights to have a bath or a shower, but once in, he wants to come out. I'm after an ECHP. The school want to do this. He's not even on SEN, just a one-to-one plan." I mean, that's very telling about how different schools and counties work. I've worked. I remember working at a mainstream school. I'd done a speech to primary school children, and there was a few SEN children there, and one of the SEN boys was just one-to-one, which felt to me very isolating. He was in a room on his own, and of course the other kids are socializing and but apparently he liked it. So if he liked it, that's fine. But I think it was interesting to see how that worked. With regards to, he loves history, but if you ask him to do things, he say, "Mummy, what should I do? My brain can't make up its mind." So maybe that's to do with, that could be also to do with variables. Offering different variables may be difficult for him. It could be to do with how, again, what I was saying about how I mentalize words, how he mentalizes the words, so what he associates with the words. What do the words actually mean for him? But if it is down to PDA, of course, asking him to go into a bath may be difficult because it's a demand, but it may be sensory integration, challenges of being in the bath, the feeling of the water, the thermos, the temperature, things like that may actually be a challenge for him. Whereas for me, it was the opposite. I was so pain dead, I would scald myself in a bath. And it didn't take me years to realise that I could use mixer taps to actually modulate the temperature in my bath, because I didn't realize I was scalding myself. So with that, it seems to me that PDA probably comes along with other things. So it's not just PDA. They may have autism with PDA. They may have dyspraxia. So actually, it just goes back to that fruit salad thing. So if PDA is diagnosed, why not actually do a multifaceted assessment, you know, where you're actually getting OT involved, a speech and language therapist, whatever. So you get a very diverse, very
I'd imagine that's the norm anyway. So hopefully, because obviously when you have an autism diagnosis, you have a speech and language occupational therapist or whatever other difficulties that you may have. So I would have thought for PDA it would be the same.
I hope so. I really do. I mean, CAMS is blocked or very, very tight at the moment. I know it is in Oxfordshire, where, you know, they're getting lots and lots of children through with a mixture of things, some not autism, but obviously CAMS, it's child and adolescent mental health services. I went there years ago in '96, and they were doing group therapy with me. I don't know if they do that now, but it seems to me that going back to what you said about delays in diagnosis, there's some, and it's not a criticism of CAMS as a service, but sadly, sometimes CAMS is reluctant to diagnose for some reason.
Yeah. And there was a question that popped up there from a nursery teacher. I don't know if you can see it, that she's saying she finds it difficult to adapt her language. And I can really understand that, because it's not the way that you would normally speak.
No, it isn't. I completely empathise with that. And when I broached it with the staff members at the day centre I used to work with, I empathise with them. This isn't the way you normally speak. In fact, the whole world is built up being quite direct, isn't it? The way, hello, how are you? How are you doing? It's all direct, because directness is how you get it's how you get an interaction going, isn't it? And how you find out about people, how you build up friendships, relationships. So if that person is having challenges in those areas, you can think forward and think, my goodness, how are they going to cope with building friendships, or going into employment, or finding a partner? And it's all about, I suppose, having space and time as a staff member to firstly get your head round this way of speaking, and also talking to other people about how they feel about it, you know, getting an open dialogue from other staff members, because they may well be in the same boat as you. You know, it isn't easy at all.
It isn't. And the thing is, everybody if you adapt your language within school, within the home, but that when you go out within the community, everybody doesn't speak like that. So
no one speaks.
I know, it's going to be really difficult for that person. So it's, you know.
Yeah, it's very hard. You're not going to go into coffee and people are going to say the cake is ready to be eaten. It's just not going to, or you know, or the croissant is ready to be bought. It just doesn't work like that. And it is, I suppose, it's about getting the balance right between saying, I understand this works for you, but be aware that the outside world, there are going to be people that don't talk how you feel comfortable with. It's going to be more the latter. I know that is very hard. It was very hard for the gentleman in question to understand why people spoke the way they did, and the feelings he got from it. So it's also taking into account their emotional sensitivities around the subject itself. And there's another thing here by Kelly. Thank you, Paul. We had our ASD and ADHD, got all the paperwork, but just not had a PDA assignment. I thought it all come in one. I thought it all come in one. I think that's what you mean.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I would have thought it the same, that if you've got multiple diagnoses, that everything would be succinct, because there's something called electronic services now, where you would hope that these things would correlate and get posted out, and you get copies.
It doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't. My mum works in legal services, and yeah, you'd think it works like that, but there's lots of red tape and things like that. So, and redaction as well. So you can get things where, I don't know if anybody's aware of what redaction is, but it's where you've got, say you have an assessment and it's brought up another family member, they have to take lines and lines of stuff out. So that's called redaction. So when I looked at my old Park Hill Hospital assessment, my CAMS, they redacted a lot of things about my father as an example.
Yeah.
Because it's all about I suppose it's morals and ethics, and also you know, confidentiality.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but still, that isn't a reason why you shouldn't get a piece of paper with a diagnosis on it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. And if you entered a little bit late, because I know some of you sort of came in a little bit later on, it is recorded, so we will be sharing the video recording fairly soon. So yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone, and thank you, Paul, for another informative workshop. Great stuff.
And thank you.
And if anyone's got any questions that you think afterwards, oh, I wish I'd asked that, just message the charity website, and then we'll pass them on to Paul, and then you can answer them a little bit later on. All right, so thank you, everyone. Try and keep cool.
Yes.
In more ways than one. So yeah, take care, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. Thanks, Tally. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.